My name is Quinn, 27 years old, and I recently bought the very house my parents kicked me out of. When my mother threw my belongings into the hallway and told me to go live in the streets so my sister could have my room, I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up my things and walked away. They thought I was a broke failure running a pathetic little internet shop. They had absolutely no idea my company was generating millions of dollars. 2 weeks later, I became their landlord. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who severely underestimated your worth. The jarring crash of a heavy cardboard box hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the upstairs hallway of my parents' upscale New Jersey home. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching in complete disbelief as my mother Patricia aggressively dumped the contents of my dresser onto the floor. Sweaters, jeans, and carefully folded shirts spilled out tangling around her expensive leather shoes. She did not even look at me as she grabbed another drawer and yanked it completely out of the wooden frame. Before I could even process what was happening, a heavy shoulder shoved past me. It was Jamal, my brother-in-law. He was a tall African-American man who insisted on wearing head-to-toe designer clothes regardless of the occasion. Today it was a flashy logo-covered jacket and pristine limited edition sneakers. He was struggling to carry a massive flat-screen television into my bedroom. Jamal was a self-proclaimed crypto entrepreneur, a man who spent more time bragging about his supposed digital assets than actually working a steady job. He grunted and bumped the expensive television against the doorframe, completely ignoring the fact that he was invading my personal space. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos erupting around me. "I just transferred $1,500 for my monthly rent to your account yesterday morning." Patricia sneered, dropping an armful of my hangers onto the growing pile of my life. "Your $1,500 is just pennies, Quinn. It barely covers the groceries you consume." She stepped over my favorite winter coat without a second glance. "Jamal and your sister are moving in today. They experienced a temporary banking error with their Manhattan penthouse, and they need a place to stay while the lawyers sort it out. Jamal needs your room for his new podcast studio. He cannot be expected to work in the basement." A banking error. The phrase hung in the air, thick with denial. Even then, I knew exactly what that meant. Jamal and Brittany had not experienced a banking error. They had been evicted. But in my family, admitting a failure belonging to the golden child was strictly forbidden. "Go live in the streets for all I care." Patricia yelled, her face flushing red with sudden, unwarranted anger. "You are 27 years old. It is time you stopped leeching off us and figured your own life out." The hypocrisy was suffocating. I paid rent. I bought my own groceries. I stayed out of their way. Yet I was the leech. The master bathroom door swung open, and Brittany strolled out casually, filing her perfectly manicured nails. My sister was 2 years older than me, but she had never truly grown up. She thrived on the pedestal my parents had built for her, basking in their blind adoration. She leaned against the doorframe, looking at the mess of my clothes with an amused smirk. "Honestly, Quinn," Brittany said, not bothering to hide the mockery in her voice, "if you had not been such a lazy dropout at 20, you would not be in this situation. You would not be running some pathetic little internet store from your childhood bedroom. You should be embarrassed." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at her, letting the cold, hard facts speak for themselves. "I did not drop out, Brittany," I said, my voice steady and piercing through the hallway. "Mom and Dad drained my entire college trust fund to pay for your lavish $150,000 destination wedding. I had to leave school because I could not pay the tuition." Brittany rolled her eyes, examining her cuticles, as if my stolen education was a minor inconvenience. "I deserved a proper start in life," she replied effortlessly. "You cannot blame me for your lack of ambition." Jamal emerged from my room, wiping fake sweat from his brow. He laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed down the stairs. "You are just a hater, Quinn. You do not understand the hustle mindset. While you are packing boxes for your little online hobby, I am building generational wealth. You have to spend money to make money. It is all about the grind." Before I could dismantle his ridiculous financial advice, The heavy oak front door downstairs opened and slammed shut. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. My father Richard reached the landing, his face tight with stress. He looked at the clothes on the floor, then at me, and his expression hardened into the familiar glare of disappointment. "Why are you still standing here?" Richard demanded, tossing my car keys directly at my chest. I caught them, the cold metal biting into my palm. "Stop being so incredibly selfish, Quinn. Jamal is on the verge of a seven-figure deal. He needs a quiet space to focus and negotiate. You are disrupting the peace of this household. Pack whatever fits in your car and leave." I looked at the three of them. My mother breathing heavily, convinced she was the victim. My sister smiling with malicious satisfaction. My father blinded by his desperate need to maintain an illusion of high society success. And Jamal, the arrogant fraud who was tearing it all down from the inside. "I hope you do not regret trading a paying tenant for a fake billionaire," I said simply. I turned around, grabbed a single duffel bag from the closet that Patricia had not yet emptied, and walked down the stairs. I did not look back. I did not beg. I walked out into the crisp New Jersey air and slid into the driver's seat of my unassuming sedan. The moment the car doors locked, my demeanor shifted. The rejected daughter vanished, and the CEO took over. I connected my phone to the Bluetooth and dialed my wealth manager. He answered on the second ring. "I need a favor," I said, my tone strictly business. "Find the mortgage for my parents' address. Buy the debt. Put it under Apex Holdings. Do it today." There was a brief pause on the line before my wealth manager replied. His voice carried a tone of distinct hesitation. "Ma'am, you might want to see the financial state of this house first. It is an absolute bloodbath." The echo of Patricia screaming for me to go live in the streets had barely faded against the high ceilings of the hallway when the master bathroom door clicked open. A cloud of expensive floral perfume rolled out, followed by my older sister Brittany. She leaned against the doorframe, leisurely dragging a crystal nail file across her perfectly manicured acrylics. She wore a silk robe that I recognized from a luxury boutique downtown, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that her husband had just aggressively shoved a massive television into my personal space. Brittany did not look at the scattered piles of my clothing or the overturned boxes littering the floor. Instead, she fixed her gaze on me with that familiar, condescending smirk she had been perfecting since we were children. "Honestly," Quinn, Brittany sighed, blowing a speck of dust off her fingernail, "you are being completely unreasonable right now. If you had not been such a lazy dropout at 20, you would not be in this situation to begin with. You would have a real career instead of running some pathetic little internet store from your childhood bedroom. You should actually be embarrassed that Jamal and I have to step in and utilize this space properly." I stared at her, feeling my jaw clench. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. For years I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace in this family. I had swallowed the blatant favoritism, the quiet indignities, and the constant dismissals of my hard work. But looking at Brittany standing there wearing clothes she probably bought on credit, while Jamal tried to physically claim the room I paid for, the dam finally broke. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to match my mother's hysterical tone. I just looked directly into Brittany's eyes and delivered the cold, hard facts. I did not drop out. "Brittany," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady pitch that made the room go entirely quiet. "Let us be very clear about the history of this family. I was forced to leave my university because Patricia and Richard marched into the bank and drained my entire college trust fund. They took every single cent of the money my grandfather left me for my education. And do you want to remind everyone exactly what that money was used for?" Brittany shifted her weight, breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second, but I did not let her interrupt the truth. "They took my tuition money to pay for your lavish $150,000 destination wedding in the Bahamas." I continued my words, hitting like stones against the silent hallway. "They handed over my future so you could have ice sculptures, imported orchids, and a 6-tier cake. I had to leave school because I literally could not pay the tuition bill the following semester. So do not stand there and call me a lazy dropout when you are wearing my college degree on your ring finger." Patricia gasped, clutching a handful of my sweaters against her chest, as if my words had physically struck her. "You ungrateful girl!" Patricia hissed, her face contorting with defensive rage. "We made a parental decision regarding family finances. You were struggling in your classes anyway. I had a 3.8 grade point average," I snapped back, refusing to take my eyes off my sister. Brittany simply rolled her eyes, recovering her smug composure with terrifying speed. She crossed her arms over her silk robe and let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed in the tight space. "Oh, please, Quinn, stop playing the victim. It is so exhausting. I was getting married to a man with immense potential. I deserved a proper start in life. A wedding is a crucial social investment for people in our circle. You were just taking generic business classes. It is not like you were going to be a surgeon. You should be thanking us for giving you an excuse to quit seeing, as you just sit around selling cheap junk online all day anyway." At that moment, Jamal emerged from my bedroom, dusting his hands off on his designer logo pants. He chuckled, a deep, booming sound that rattled my nerves. He wrapped a heavy arm around Brittany's shoulders and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head before looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. "You are just a hater," Quinn, Jamal said, pointing a finger at me as if he were scolding a child. "You do not understand the hustle mindset at all. While you are packing cardboard boxes for your little online hobby, I am out here building generational wealth. You have to spend money to make money. It is all about the grind, the vision. Your sister and I are navigating high-level asset reallocation right now. We are playing a game you cannot even comprehend. Taking this room is just a strategic pivot for my new Web3 podcast studio. If you had any real drive, you would have bought your own house by now, instead of crying about some old college money from 7 years ago." The sheer delusion of his statement was almost impressive. Jamal was lecturing me about generational wealth while literally moving his television into his sister-in-law's childhood bedroom because he had failed to pay rent on his own apartment. He was talking about hustle mindset while stealing the space I legally rented from my parents. But they all believed it. Patricia nodded along with Jamal's words, gazing at him with utter adoration, as if he were a financial genius rather than a man who relied entirely on my parents' credit cards to fund his lifestyle. I opened my mouth to completely dismantle Jamal's fake crypto guru persona, but a heavy sound interrupted me. The solid oak front door downstairs unlatched and slammed shut with a reverberating thud. Heavy, purposeful footsteps pounded up the hardwood staircase. My father, Richard, reached the landing, his face tight with stress and his tie pulled loose around his collar. He stopped at the top of the stairs, taking in the chaotic scene. He looked at my clothes scattered across the floor, at Jamal leaning against my doorframe, at Patricia holding my empty hangers, and finally his gaze locked onto me. His expression hardened into the familiar glare of absolute disappointment he always reserved just for me. "Why are you still standing here?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing through the tense hallway. He pushed past Jamal and stood directly in front of me, his face flushed red with a volatile mixture of exhaustion and misplaced authority. He pointed a trembling finger at the pile of my clothes on the floor, then jerked his thumb toward the staircase. He told me I was being unbelievably selfish and short-sighted. He raised his voice, making sure every single person in the house could hear his unwavering support for the golden couple standing behind him. "Jamal is finalizing a 7-figure Web3 deal this week," Richard announced, puffing out his chest, as if he were the one signing the lucrative contract. "The boy is about to secure our family legacy. He is operating at a level of financial literacy you cannot even fathom. He needs a quiet, dedicated space to focus and negotiate with high-level venture capitalists. You are disrupting the peace and prosperity of this household with your petty jealousy and your refusal to support your sister." I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. He was wearing a faded golf polo that had seen better days, desperately clinging to the illusion of country club wealth while aggressively defending a son-in-law who had clearly conned them all. Patricia stood behind him, crossing her arms in triumph, while Brittany smirked from the master bathroom door, her silk robe catching the hallway light. Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out the spare keys to my unassuming sedan, and tossed them hard at my chest. I caught them before they hit the ground, the cold metal biting sharply into my palm. "Pack whatever fits in your trunk and leave," Richard ordered, his tone devoid of any parental warmth. "We have real business to attend to. We cannot have your negative energy dragging down Jamal's momentum." I looked at the four of them, taking a mental photograph of the sheer delusion occupying my childhood home. My mother was breathing heavily, entirely convinced she was the victim of an ungrateful child. My sister was smiling with malicious satisfaction, already planning how to decorate the space she had just stolen through manipulation. My father was completely blinded by his desperate need to maintain an illusion of high society success, willing to sacrifice his youngest daughter to keep up appearances. And Jamal was the arrogant fraud, the parasite who was tearing their financial stability down from the inside out while pretending to be a self-made mogul. I did not drop to my knees. I did not beg for a few more days to find a new apartment. I did not shed a single tear for a family that had consistently chosen a fabricated aesthetic over their own flesh and blood. I calmly bent down and zipped up my jacket. I grabbed the single black duffel bag from the closet that Patricia had not yet managed to empty, hoisting the heavy strap over my shoulder. I stood up straight and looked directly into my father's eyes, holding his gaze until he shifted his weight uncomfortably under my steady stare. "I hope you do not regret trading a paying tenant for a fake billionaire," I said simply. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, a flat statement of undeniable fact that hung heavily in the tense hallway air. Jamal let out an exaggerated scoff, shaking his head and muttering about my lack of vision, but I was already turning away. I walked down the hardwood stairs, each step deliberate and measured. I passed framed family portraits lining the stairwell pictures, where Brittany was always placed front and center while I was pushed to the edges. I could hear them immediately start celebrating upstairs. Brittany loudly claimed she wanted to paint my walls a trendy shade of gray, while Patricia fussed over Jamal, asking what he wanted for a celebratory lunch. I did not look back. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the crisp New Jersey air, letting the door click shut firmly behind me. The moment that door closed, the heavy burden of playing the disappointed daughter vanished entirely. I walked down the paved driveway toward my reliable, unassuming sedan. It was the kind of vehicle that blended into any grocery store parking lot, completely masking the fact that the woman unlocking the doors possessed a net worth significantly higher than the combined value of every single luxury home on this manicured suburban street. They thought I was running a failing internet shop. They had no idea my logistics network spanned 3 continents. I tossed my duffel bag onto the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and absolute. I gripped the leather steering wheel, taking one deep, cleansing breath. The sadness was gone, completely replaced by a razor-sharp, calculated focus. The rejected daughter was dead. The chief executive officer took over. I pressed the start button, the engine purring to life, and quickly connected my phone to the Bluetooth system on the dashboard. I tapped the screen and dialed my wealth manager, David. He answered on the second ring, his tone immediately professional and alert. "Good afternoon, Quinn," David greeted me smoothly. "How can I assist you today?" I pulled out of the driveway, checking my rearview mirror one last time to watch my childhood home shrink in the distance. "I need a massive favor," I said, my tone strictly business, cutting through any pleasantries. "Find the mortgage for my parents' address in New Jersey. I want you to buy the debt. Put it entirely under Apex Holdings. Do it today, whatever the premium costs. Bypass the usual committee reviews and fast-track the acquisition." There was a distinct heavy pause on the line. I knew I was asking for a highly aggressive maneuver. Buying residential debt directly from a lender required significant capital and immediate leverage. 2 things Apex Holdings had in abundance. I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard as David immediately pulled up the public financial records associated with the property address I had given him. He was a man who moved millions of dollars before lunch, but the silence stretched for several seconds longer than usual. "Ma'am," David finally replied, his voice carrying a tone of deep hesitation and genuine concern. "You might want to see the financial state of this house first. It is a bloodbath." I told David I would be at the headquarters in 20 minutes and ended the call. The drive into the city was a blur of highway markers and morning traffic, but my mind was operating with absolute clarity. Walking into the Apex Holdings building always grounded me. The polished concrete floors, the subtle hum of genuine productivity, and the crisp aesthetic of my empire stood in stark contrast to the chaotic facade of my parents' suburban home. I bypassed my private office and walked straight into the main boardroom. The space was encased in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, offering a sweeping view of the skyline. It was a room designed for executing high-level acquisitions, not dealing with petty family drama. Today, it would serve both purposes. David was already waiting at the long mahogany table. Sitting next to him was Marcus, my lead corporate attorney. Neither man looked particularly happy. Marcus adjusted his glasses and slid a thick manila folder across the smooth wooden surface toward me. The tab on the folder simply bore my parents' home address. "Explain this to me," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Break it down." Marcus leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "Your parents owned that house outright a decade ago, Quinn. It was fully paid off. But starting 5 years ago, they began leveraging the equity. They took out a primary mortgage, followed by a second, and then a third high-yield home equity line of credit. The interest rates on the third loan are predatory. They have leveraged the property for roughly $1.8 million over its actual market value." I flipped through the bank statements, tracking the massive outflows of cash. "Where did all this liquidity go?" I asked. "They certainly did not spend $1.8 million on home renovations." "The kitchen still has the same Formica countertops from my childhood." David tapped a specific spreadsheet in the folder. "We tracked the wire transfers. The majority of the funds were funneled directly into 3 separate limited liability companies registered to your brother-in-law Jamal. These entities appear to be shell companies for various unregistered cryptocurrency ventures. All 3 companies currently show a zero balance. The money is entirely gone, evaporated into failed digital assets and unregistered coin offerings." I stared at the black and white proof of Jamal's absolute incompetence. He had drained my parents' equity to play venture capitalist, and they had willingly handed over the keys to their financial security. "What about the rest of the funds?" I asked, turning to the next page. Marcus pointed to a long column of credit card payoffs. "The remaining capital was used to aggressively pay down high-limit credit cards registered to your sister Brittany. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on luxury designer goods, international first-class flights, and extended stays at 5-star resorts. They effectively financed a billionaire lifestyle, using the physical roof over their heads as collateral." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "And Jamal's Manhattan penthouse, the one they claimed they had to vacate due to a banking error." David shook his head, sliding a legal notice across the table. "There was no banking error. Jamal and Brittany were formally evicted by the New York County Sheriff. They stopped paying rent 8 months ago. The landlord secured a court judgment against them last week. They did not temporarily relocate to New Jersey to set up a podcast studio. They fled Manhattan because they were legally locked out of their apartment and their credit is completely destroyed." The sheer scale of the deception was almost admirable in its audacity. They were all standing in my childhood hallway, mocking my internet store, while actively hiding the fact that they were completely destitute. They had thrown me out onto the street to accommodate a man who had bankrupted the entire family. "What is the current status of the New Jersey property?" I asked, closing the folder and looking directly at Marcus. "The primary lender initiated foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago." Marcus explained, his tone strictly professional. "Your parents have ignored every single warning notice. The grace period has completely lapsed. The bank is exactly 30 days away from seizing the property and auctioning it off. They are about to be thrown out onto the street by the state. Buy the debt," I said immediately. Quinn, David cautioned, raising a hand. "As your wealth manager, I must advise against this. This asset is toxic. It is a highly distressed property completely underwater. Purchasing this debt offers absolutely no strategic return on investment for Apex Holdings." "I am not looking for a return on investment, David," I replied, my voice hard and resolute. "I am looking for leverage." I want Apex Holdings to purchase the entirety of that debt portfolio before the bank moves to auction. Pay whatever premium the bank requires to expedite the transfer of the deed. I want to own the paper by the end of the day." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding the legal maneuvering at play. If Apex buys the debt, you assume all rights of the creditor. You become the legal owner of the property. You will hold the absolute right to execute the eviction. That is exactly the point I stated. Draft the acquisition papers. Marcus opened his briefcase and produced the necessary corporate authorization forms. I did not hesitate. I picked up my pen and signed my name across the heavy bond paper, the ink flowing smoothly. With those few strokes of a pen, I legally purchased the very ground my parents stood on. I bought the walls they used to shelter the sister who despised me, and the brother-in-law who mocked me. I was no longer the unwanted daughter taking up space in the spare bedroom. I was their sole creditor. I was their landlord. I held their entire future in the palm of my hand. Marcus gathered the signed documents, promising to have the wire transfers executed before the market closed. As he slid the papers into his briefcase, my phone lit up on the mahogany table. The screen glowed brightly against the dark wood. A notification banner popped up displaying a new message in the family group chat. The glowing banner on my phone screen read, "The Wilson family," and displayed 3 unread notifications. I picked up the device, unlocking the screen while Marcus and David watched me in respectful silence. The first message was a photograph from Jamal. He had wasted absolutely no time claiming his new territory. The image was a wide-angle selfie taken from the dead center of my former bedroom. The walls, which I had carefully painted a calming sage green just 2 years ago, were already half covered in cheap, jagged charcoal-colored acoustic foam squares, attached with heavy-duty tape. A blindingly bright purple neon sign that read "Hustle Harder" was leaning haphazardly against my old oak dresser. Jamal was standing in the foreground wearing a ridiculous oversized gold chain, flashing a peace sign at the camera. He looked incredibly smug, completely unaware that he was standing inside a house that currently belonged to the very person he had just evicted. The second message was from my sister. Brittany had typed out a massive block of text directly beneath Jamal's absurd photograph. She went on endlessly about how the air in the house already felt so much lighter and more positive. She claimed my dark negative energy had been severely blocking Jamal's creative flow and preventing him from reaching his full potential as an entrepreneur. She ended her text by saying that true family members support each other unconditionally, completely failing to recognize the blatant, glaring hypocrisy of her own statement. She was celebrating throwing her sister onto the street to accommodate a man who could not even pay his own rent. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of Brittany's message, a third text popped up. This one was from Patricia. My mother always loved to play the benevolent peacekeeper only after she had already done the maximum amount of damage. Her text was dripping with toxic condescension. She wrote that she and Richard had discussed the situation over lunch and decided they did not want to see me sleeping in my car like a vagrant. She generously offered me a place in the detached, unheated garage out back. There was, of course, a massive caveat attached to this alleged kindness. I could only bring a sleeping bag into the garage if I first issued a formal written apology to Jamal for my disrespectful tone and promised to start acting like a supportive, loving sister. I sat back in my plush leather executive chair, letting the sheer absurdity of their messages wash over me. The contrast between my current reality and their fabricated delusions was staggering. I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar corporate boardroom, flanked by top-tier legal and financial advisors who hung on my every word. I had just acquired the deed to their home, saving them from imminent public ruin, and my mother was offering me the concrete floor of an unheated garage in exchange for my total submission. David noticed the slight shift in my expression. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. "Is everything all right with the family, Quinn?" he asked, his tone laced with genuine professional curiosity. "They are celebrating their real estate acquisition," I replied smoothly. I picked up my porcelain coffee cup and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast. It tasted like absolute victory. I set the cup down and decided it was time to initiate the first phase of my strategy. I was not going to drop the massive bomb of the mortgage acquisition just yet. That required perfect timing and a larger audience. Instead, I wanted to deliver a precise, calculated strike, a drip reveal. I wanted to crack their absolute certainty that I was a destitute failure without giving away my entire hand. I swiped out of the messaging app and opened my personal email client. I searched for a specific document I had received earlier that morning. It was a digital receipt from a highly respected local women's shelter acknowledging a recent philanthropic contribution. I took a screenshot of the official document. Using the basic photo editing tools on my phone, I carefully blurred out my full legal name and the Apex Holdings corporate crest at the top of the invoice. I left the date, the official shelter letterhead, the transaction ID, and the final donation amount completely visible. $50,000. It was a generous donation, but for my company, it was a standard quarterly write-off. For my family, who were currently drowning in secret toxic debt while pretending to be high society elites, it was an astronomical figure. It was more money than Jamal had ever seen in a single legitimate bank account. I attached the edited image to the family group chat. I did not write a long defensive paragraph explaining my success or outlining my corporate assets. I did not justify my career choices or attack Brittany for her delusion. I kept my response incredibly brief, matching the cold, detached energy they had shown me all morning. "Don't worry, my negative energy is doing just fine," I typed. I hit send. I placed my phone face up on the boardroom table right next to the signed acquisition papers that declared me the owner of their heavily mortgaged estate. I watched the screen, waiting for the inevitable reaction. I knew exactly how they would respond. Their egos were far too fragile to process the concept that I might actually be successful. Their entire family dynamic relied on me being the designated failure. If I was succeeding, their superiority complex would immediately collapse. The response was almost instantaneous. The screen lit up with a rapid-fire barrage of incoming notifications. Jamal was the first to react, responding exactly as a cornered, insecure fraud always does. His message consisted of 6 crying, laughing emojis in a row. He followed the emojis with a single aggressive text message, accusing me of downloading fake donation receipts from Google Images just to look rich. I did not dignify Jamal's pathetic accusation with a response. I simply locked my phone screen, placed the device face down on the polished mahogany table, and turned my full attention back to my legal counsel. Let Jamal believe whatever he needed to believe to protect his fragile, rapidly crumbling ego. He was a desperate man, clinging to a fabricated reality, while the undeniable concrete truth was sitting in a stack of legal documents right in front of me. Over the next 48 hours, my financial and legal teams worked with ruthless efficiency to finalize the acquisition. David orchestrated the aggressive buyout of the 3 separate highly toxic mortgages my parents had recklessly taken out, while Marcus ensured the swift, unassailable transfer of the deed. By Thursday morning, the paperwork was completely sealed. The primary residential lender was entirely bought out. The impending bank foreclosure was officially canceled, and Apex Holdings became the sole entity holding the paper on the New Jersey estate. I now legally owned the walls, the roof, and the very ground my toxic family stood on. I was sitting at the expansive desk in my private office that afternoon, reviewing a highly lucrative logistics contract for a new European shipping route when the quiet focus of the room was shattered. My personal cell phone resting next to my keyboard illuminated with a rapid, aggressive succession of notifications. It was the family group chat completely erupting with a sudden chaotic burst of digital activity. I picked up the device leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair and opened the message thread. Patricia had sent a massive, breathless block of text that practically vibrated with hysterical relief. She was praising a higher power, declaring that a literal financial miracle had just occurred and saved the family from absolute ruin. She explained in a frantic flurry of typos and exclamation points that she had just received an official expedited courier package directly from the bank. The brutal foreclosure proceedings, which had been ruthlessly counting down to an armed eviction in less than 30 days, had been completely halted. A massive anonymous investment firm called Apex Holdings had unexpectedly swooped in, purchased the entirety of their distressed residential debt, and granted them an immediate open-ended grace period. Patricia was digitally weeping with joy in her messages declaring that their precious social standing was secure and that they would not have to face the ultimate crushing humiliation of being thrown out of their upscale neighborhood. She praised the sheer luck of the universe for sparing them from the consequences of their own catastrophic financial mismanagement. Before I could even process the sheer irony of my mother's dramatic outpourings, Jamal dominated the chat. He did not ask logical questions or express normal confusion about this mysterious corporate savior swooping out of the sky. Instead, he immediately and shamelessly seized total credit for the entire multi-million-dollar transaction. He sent a highly arrogant audio message followed by a lengthy, boastful text claiming that he had personally utilized his high-level Wall Street connections to orchestrate the entire buyout. He brazenly stated that he had been working relentlessly behind the scenes all week, leveraging his vast, powerful network of venture capitalists to pull massive strings at the absolute highest echelons of corporate finance. He spun an elaborate, completely fabricated tale about how he had personally called in a massive career, defining favor with the elusive, brilliant CEO of Apex Holdings to rescue his beloved in-laws from the predatory banking system. He literally typed the words, "You are welcome." That is what a real provider does when his family is under fire. I told you big things were happening. He officially, without a single shred of hesitation or proof, crowned himself the supreme savior of the entire family. Brittany, predictably, was incredibly quick to worship at the altar of her husband's absolute delusion. She flooded the chat with clapping hands, fire icons, and heart emojis, praising Jamal for his brilliant, unmatched financial mind and his relentless dedication to protecting their family legacy. She could not resist weaving a subtle, venomous dig at me into her digital celebration. She typed that it was an absolute blessing to finally have a true, powerful visionary leading the house, someone who actually understood how the real high-stakes corporate world operated, unlike certain bitter people who just dragged the family down with petty grievances and fake Google image charity receipts. The sheer scale of their collective delusion was breathtaking. I sat in my office watching the text messages roll in, completely fascinated by the psychology of their lies. They were openly celebrating the very company I had built from nothing. They were endlessly praising the very CEO they had just kicked out onto the cold street without a second thought. And they were doing it all while a broke, unemployed fraud actively took the credit for my aggressive, highly calculated financial takeover. Jamal was digging his own grave with every single keystroke, building a towering monument of lies that was destined to collapse directly on top of him. I sat in my CEO chair, staring at the brightly lit screen, reading Jamal's blatant, arrogant lie about knowing the head of Apex Holdings. I did not feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp sense of absolute control. The trap was set perfectly, and they had just eagerly marched right into the center of it. I tapped the text box, crafting a very specific, calculated reply that would set the stage for the final dismantling of their entire fabricated reality. Wow, we definitely need to throw a huge BBQ to celebrate Jamal's incredible connections. The chat bubble denoting my message had barely turned blue before Patricia began typing. Her response was a chaotic flurry of capital letters and celebratory emojis. She thought the barbecue idea was an absolute stroke of genius. She immediately hijacked the concept, declaring that Sunday afternoon would be the perfect time for a grand neighborhood gathering. She wanted to invite the local country club members, her weekly bridge group, and all of Richard's remaining business associates. This was not just going to be a simple family dinner. It was going to be a highly orchestrated public coronation. In a subsequent message, Patricia explicitly stated her ultimate goal for the gathering: She proudly announced that Richard had contacted his attorney and was preparing to legally transfer the deed of the house directly to Jamal and Brittany. According to my mother's deeply flawed logic, since Jamal had single-handedly saved the estate from the predatory banking system using his mythical Wall Street connections, he deserved to be the rightful lord of the manor. They were going to pass the torch to the new generation of wealth builders. A few minutes later, a separate direct message from Patricia arrived on my private screen. Even in her moment of supposed absolute victory, she could not resist twisting the knife one last time. "You are expected to be there at 2 o'clock sharp." Patricia wrote, the toxic condescension bleeding through the digital text. "Come see what real success looks like. Maybe Jamal will give you a job fetching coffee for his podcast. Minimum wage is better than whatever you are making peddling junk online." I stared at the glowing screen, a cold smile stretching across my face. I tapped the keyboard, my fingers moving with swift, clinical precision. "I will be there," I replied. The moment I set my phone face down on the glass surface of my desk, I pressed the intercom button to summon Marcus. My lead corporate attorney walked in holding a fresh stack of legal folios, his expression all business. I instructed him to completely finalize the foreclosure transfer documents. I wanted every single signature authenticated, every notary seal perfectly stamped, and every potential legal loophole permanently sealed shut. "Richard cannot transfer a deed he no longer controls," Marcus stated, taking a seat opposite my desk and opening his leather-bound notepad. "The moment Apex Holdings acquired the debt portfolio from the primary lender, your parents lost all legal authority to assign the property to a third party. If Richard tries to file any transfer paperwork with the county clerk on Monday morning, it will be immediately flagged and rejected as a fraudulent conveyance." "He will not get the chance to file anything on Monday," I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. "I want the formal eviction notices drafted today. I want the proof of Apex Holdings' total ownership printed on high-stock corporate paper. We are going to hand-deliver the reality check they so desperately need." David, my wealth manager, entered the office right on cue, carrying the final financial audit of Jamal's ruined credit history. "The asset transfer to Apex is officially registered with the state," David confirmed, placing the heavy file next to my keyboard. "You are the sole creditor, Quinn. You hold the absolute legal right to vacate the premises at your discretion." "Perfect," I said. "Prepare a physical dossier for me to take on Sunday. I want the eviction notices for Jamal and Brittany placed right on top. I want the foreclosure finalization for my parents directly underneath that. And I want a complete itemized breakdown of exactly where their $1.8 million went. I want Jamal's fake corporate shell companies exposed line by line, transaction by transaction. I want the undeniable proof that he bankrupted them." Marcus nodded his pen, scratching rapidly across his legal pad. "We will ensure a licensed process server is on standby near the property just in case they refuse to accept the documents directly from you. We have to maintain absolute legal compliance during an eviction proceeding. I will personally hand them the documents," I assured him, my voice dangerously calm. "I want to look them directly in the eyes when they finally realize the anonymous investment firm they have been worshipping is actually the daughter they just threw onto the street." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in strategic anticipation. I spent Friday evening reviewing the specific legal statutes regarding eviction in New Jersey, ensuring I knew my rights as a property owner inside and out. I knew Jamal would try to manipulate the facts the second he was confronted. I knew Richard would puff out his chest and threaten baseless legal action. I needed to be armed with irrefutable statutes and undeniable hard proof. Saturday passed in a quiet, calculating stillness. I deliberately ignored the barrage of updates flooding the family group chat. Brittany was posting pictures of the premium steaks, imported wine, and artisanal decorations she had purchased, using my parents' rapidly dwindling credit limits. Patricia was agonizing over floral arrangements for the patio and hiring a private caterer they absolutely could not afford. They were lavishly celebrating their own financial execution, completely unaware that the guillotine had already dropped. By Sunday morning, the atmosphere in my high-rise penthouse felt electric. I finished my morning coffee, the bitter espresso sharpening my focus. The time for hiding in plain sight was officially over. For years, I had deliberately worn faded sweatpants, oversized college hoodies, and scuffed sneakers around my family. I had actively cultivated the appearance of a struggling, aimless 20-something to avoid their constant financial demands and endless interrogations. I had let them believe I was exactly the failure they wanted me to be, because it kept them out of my bank accounts. I walked down the long sunlit hallway of my penthouse and stepped into my massive walk-in closet. The space was the size of a small boutique lined with custom track lighting and glass display cases. Rows of pristine tailored designer suits hung in perfect chromatic order. Shelves of immaculate Italian leather heels lined the back wall, reflecting the morning light. I ran my fingers along the crisp fabric of a structured charcoal gray blazer with sharp, commanding shoulders. I paired it with sleek tailored trousers and a pair of pitch-black stiletto heels that echoed against the hardwood floor. I was not going to show up to this barbecue looking like the quiet, rejected daughter they had easily discarded. I was the chief executive officer of a global logistics empire. I was the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings. I was the legal owner of the very ground they were preparing to party on. It was time to shed the disguise. It was time to look exactly like the predator I truly was. The charcoal gray fabric settled perfectly against my shoulders, the bespoke tailoring acting as a modern suit of armor. I fastened the genuine Cartier watch around my left wrist, the cool, heavy gold a grounding reminder of the empire I had built with my own two hands. I bypassed the keys to my daily driver and instead texted my personal driver requesting the company vehicle. If my mother wanted to see what real success looked like, I was going to deliver a masterclass. The drive from my downtown penthouse to the sprawling manicured suburbs of my childhood took exactly 45 minutes. I sat in the spacious, immaculate leather back seat of the jet-black Mercedes G-Wagon, watching the skyline fade into rows of identical colonial homes. The heavy tinted windows shielded me from the outside world, giving me the perfect vantage point to observe without being seen. As we turned onto my parents' street, the smell of lighter fluid and burning charcoal seeped through the climate control system. Cars lined both sides of the road bumper to bumper, signaling that Patricia had indeed invited half the county to witness this fabricated coronation. Laughter and loud music echoed over the perfectly trimmed hedges. My driver brought the massive military-grade vehicle to a smooth, silent halt directly at the base of my parents' driveway, deliberately blocking the entrance. I did not move immediately. I sat in the cool air-conditioned shadows of the back seat and watched the pathetic theatrical production unfolding on the front lawn. Jamal had positioned himself perfectly at the epicenter of the gathering. He was standing by the massive stainless steel grill, a pair of silver tongs in one hand and a local craft beer in the other. He was wearing a tight polo shirt designed to show off his arms, and his wrist was prominently displayed for the entire crowd to see. Even from 20 feet away through tinted glass, the watch was an offensive, glaring counterfeit. The gold plating had that cheap, brassy undertone, and the sweeping motion of the second hand was completely wrong for a luxury timepiece. He was holding court, surrounded by a captive audience of my gullible aunt's uncles and my father's former business associates. His voice was booming, intentionally projected, so that everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear his ridiculous corporate fairy tales. He was regaling them with a completely fictionalized account of his high-stakes negotiations with the top brass at Apex Holdings. He aggressively pantomimed how he had slammed his fist on a mahogany table, demanding the shadowy CEO back off his family's estate. He claimed he had called in markers from his days running hedge funds, terrifying the massive investment firm into total submission. The crowd was eating it out of the palm of his hand. Patricia was standing just a few feet away, beaming with sickening pride, while my father nodded along, completely oblivious to the fact that he was applauding the man who had actively orchestrated his financial ruin. It was time to end the show. I tapped the glass divider, signaling my driver. He immediately stepped out of the vehicle. He was immaculately dressed in a crisp black suit and a pressed white shirt. He walked around the hood of the massive G-Wagon, his footsteps crunching loudly against the gravel driveway. The sheer, imposing presence of the vehicle had already drawn the eyes of several neighbors. The chatter near the front of the lawn began to taper off, rippling backward until it reached the grill. My driver grasped the heavy chrome handle and pulled the heavy door open. I stepped out into the afternoon sun. My black stiletto heels struck the pavement with a sharp, definitive crack. I stood to my full height, the charcoal suit radiating absolute corporate authority. The sunlight caught the face of my Cartier watch, casting a brilliant, blinding reflection across the driveway. I did not smile. I did not wave. I simply stood by the open door of a vehicle that cost more than my parents' entire remaining retirement fund and locked eyes with my family. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The backyard fell dead silent. The upbeat pop music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly sounded painfully loud in the vacuum of human voices. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Drinks were lowered. Dozens of relatives and neighbors simply stood frozen, their eyes darting wildly between my sharp designer exterior, the intimidating luxury vehicle behind me, and the uniformed driver waiting respectfully by my side. The cognitive dissonance was breaking their brains. The designated family failure had just arrived looking like a billionaire. The profound, stunned silence lasted for 10 agonizing seconds before the reality of my presence completely shattered Brittany's fragile composure. I watched my sister's face rapidly transition from shock to confusion to a deep, violently flushed crimson. She could not handle the shift in attention. This was supposed to be her day of triumph. She was supposed to be the newly crowned queen of the estate, and I was supposed to crawl up the driveway in a beat-up sedan begging for a space in the garage. Brittany dropped her plastic cup onto the grass and stormed across the lawn. Her heels sank into the turf with every angry, aggressive step. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest, her voice shrill and echoing loudly in the quiet yard. "You have got to be kidding me!" she shrieked, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated jealousy. She wildly gestured toward the G-Wagon and then swept her hand up and down my tailored suit. "You actually went out and rented a luxury car just to show up here and try to ruin my day. You rented designer clothes to pretend you are something you are not. You are so pathetic and bitter that you literally maxed out whatever tiny credit limit you have left just to steal my spotlight. You are a complete fraud." I did not break eye contact with her. I did not raise my voice or rush to defend myself against her desperate, frantic accusations. I simply let her completely unravel in front of the entire neighborhood, allowing her own screaming insecurity to echo off the siding of the house. Sensing that his wife was losing control of the narrative, and realizing that his captive audience was now entirely focused on the imposing presence radiating from the driveway, Jamal decided he needed to intervene. He aggressively shoved his grill tongs into the hands of a bewildered uncle and strutted across the lawn. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his fake Rolex, desperately trying to project an aura of masculine dominance that he did not possess. He stopped right beside Brittany, crossing his arms and leaning forward, attempting to physically intimidate me with his proximity. He scoffed loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighbors watching over the fence. "Let us hear it then," Quinn Jamal demanded, his tone dripping with toxic, arrogant condescension. "Tell the whole family. Exactly how much high-interest, predatory credit card debt are you drowning in right now just to pull off this pathetic fake stunt?" I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice, cross my arms defensively, or offer a single syllable of justification regarding my finances. Instead, I let a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. I casually shifted my weight, leaning back against the pristine, sun-warmed exterior of the G-Wagon. I crossed my ankles, adjusting the cuff of my blazer so the Cartier watch caught the afternoon sunlight, and looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. "You know what, Jamal?" I said, my voice projecting effortlessly over the quiet hum of the backyard. "You are absolutely right. I am not a Wall Street insider. I am just a woman who sells things online. So since we are all gathered here to celebrate your massive financial victory, why do you not educate me? Educate all of us." I gestured expansively toward the crowd of breathless relatives and nosy neighbors pressing in against the patio furniture. "Walk us through it," I challenged smoothly. Explain exactly how you negotiated with Apex Holdings to secure the release of this property's debt portfolio. We would all love a masterclass in high-level corporate finance. Jamal hesitated for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted to Brittany, then back to the crowd. He was a man who survived entirely on bluffing, and the sheer, unblinking confidence radiating from me had briefly short-circuited his usual bravado. But his ego simply could not allow him to back down in front of an audience. He puffed out his chest, adjusted his counterfeit watch, and took the bait hook, line, and sinker. It is complex corporate structuring, Quinn. Jamal began adopting a loud, patronizing tone as he turned to address the crowd, like he was hosting a seminar. You would not grasp the nuances, but essentially, I leveraged my blockchain equities to create a dynamic collateral buffer. Then I reached out to my private network to synergize the mortgage APRs directly with Apex's primary liquidity providers. He paused, letting the meaningless jargon hang in the air, grinning as a few of my older aunts nodded in clueless agreement. I utilized a decentralized ledger protocol to bypass the primary lender's foreclosure mandate. He continued gaining momentum as he spun his web of absolute nonsense. Once I got the CEO of Apex on a direct line, we negotiated a restructuring of the distressed assets using a crypto-backed collateralization strategy. It took intense high-level maneuvering, but I locked down the grace period. He crossed his arms, looking incredibly satisfied with his word salad. Like I said, real business. Not something you can buy with a rented credit card. I let the silence stretch out for 3 full seconds. I let him bask in his fabricated glory. Then I systematically, coldly, and publicly dismantled him. That was fascinating, Jamal. I said, my tone shifting from conversational to razor sharp. Truly. The only problem is that absolutely every single word you just spoke is a complete financial impossibility. I pushed myself off the vehicle and took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward him. First, I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the manicured lawn. Blockchain equities are entirely irrelevant to traditional distressed residential debt acquisitions. They do not exist in this sector. Second, you cannot synergize an APR. An annual percentage rate is a mathematical figure dictated by federal lending standards, not a corporate culture initiative. Third, primary lenders do not care about decentralized ledgers. They care about liquid capital and executing foreclosure judgments to recoup their bonded investments. Jamal's smug smile began to slip. A slight sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised a hand, silencing him instantly. When a massive investment firm like Apex Holdings purchases a distressed debt portfolio, I continued, speaking with the absolute unquestionable authority of the person who had literally signed the paperwork. They do not negotiate with a third-party relative claiming to hold crypto collateral. They buy the paper directly from the bank at a premium to secure the primary creditor rights. The original homeowner, or their boastful son-in-law, is completely cut out of the transaction until the new owner decides whether to foreclose, evict, or restructure. The relatives were no longer nodding. They were staring at Jamal, their expressions morphing from admiration to deep, uncomfortable suspicion. The utter lack of logic in his story had been laid bare under the harsh light of actual financial mechanics. Jamal took a step back, his eyes darting frantically. "You are just throwing around buzzwords you read on the internet," he stammered, his voice losing its booming resonance. "You have no idea who I talk to or what kind of pull I have." I took one more step forward, closing the distance between us. I dropped my voice slightly, forcing the crowd to lean in to hear the final devastating blow. "You didn't talk to the CEO of Apex, Jamal," I said smoothly, my eyes locking onto his panicked gaze. "Because the CEO of Apex doesn't take phone calls from men with a 480 credit score who just got legally evicted from a rented, insect-infested studio apartment in Queens." The reaction was instantaneous. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the backyard. Aunt Martha actually dropped her paper plate, sending potato salad splattering onto the patio stones. Whispers erupted among the country club members. The Manhattan penthouse story, the foundation of Jamal and Brittany's entire elite persona, had just been completely obliterated. Jamal's face dropped. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and completely exposed. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His entire fabricated identity was dissolving in real time. Brittany let out a shrill, hysterical noise, grabbing Jamal's arm, looking wildly at the judging faces of their neighbors. Before the true weight of the humiliation could fully settle over them, the sliding glass door at the back of the house was violently thrown open. Richard pushed his way through the dense crowd of whispering relatives. His face was a dark, mottled purple, a vein pulsing dangerously in his neck. He shoved his way to the front, furious that the carefully curated family image was being dismantled and absolutely enraged that the unwanted daughter was publicly humiliating his golden son-in-law. Richard shoved his way to the front, his heavy breathing audible even over the stunned murmurs of the crowd. He marched directly up to Jamal, throwing a protective paternal arm around the younger man's shoulder before turning his furious glare entirely on me. His face was a dark mottled purple, the veins pulsing dangerously against his temples. For a moment he was so angry he could barely form a coherent sentence, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the words to destroy me in front of his audience. "How dare you come into my home and speak to my family this way?" Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice making several nearby neighbors flinch and step backward. "You strut in here wearing rented clothes, driving a rented car, spouting utter nonsense you probably memorized from a Wikipedia article just to embarrass your sister on her special day." He pointed a trembling finger right at my face. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the frantic desperation in his eyes to regain control of the narrative. Brittany was clinging to his other arm, crying fake performative tears, playing the victim with practiced ease. Patricia had flanked him on the right, her jaw set, glaring at me like I was a criminal who had trespassed on her sacred ground. "Jamal is a visionary," Richard shouted to the crowd, desperately trying to repair the damage I had just inflicted on his golden boy's reputation. "He is a financial genius who single-handedly saved this family from a minor temporary cash flow issue. He negotiated with the top executives in the country. He has connections you could not even dream of, Quinn. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter failure trying to tear down a man who has actually achieved something." I stood perfectly still, letting his tirade wash over me without a single reaction. "Get off my property," Richard commanded, his voice echoing off the brick facade of the house he no longer owned. "I want you out of my sight. I want that obnoxious truck out of my driveway. You are not welcome here. You are not welcome in this family." He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest, preparing to deliver what he clearly believed would be the ultimate devastating blow. He looked around at the audience, making sure every aunt, uncle, and country club acquaintance was hanging on his every word. He wanted witnesses for his grand gesture of loyalty to his chosen daughter. "In fact, since you want to come here and talk about assets and ownership," Richard announced, his voice booming with theatrical authority, "I am going to make something absolutely clear right here and right now. First thing Monday morning, I am calling my attorney. I am signing the deed of this entire estate directly over to Brittany and Jamal. They have proven their worth. They have proven their absolute loyalty to this family." He sneered at me, a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. "You are officially written out of everything, Quinn. You will not see a single dime of my money. You will not inherit a single blade of grass on this lawn. I am legally washing my hands of you. You are entirely cut off." The crowd erupted into a flurry of shocked whispers. Several of the older relatives covered their mouths, scandalized by the brutal public disownment. Brittany let out a victorious little sob, burying her face in Jamal's shoulder. Jamal managed to recover a fraction of his swagger, shooting me a triumphant, arrogant smirk. Patricia crossed her arms, nodding in solemn agreement with her husband's harsh decree. They stood united, a fortress of delusion, convinced they had just dealt me a fatal, humiliating defeat. I did not flinch. I did not shed a tear, raise my voice, or show a single ounce of the devastation they so desperately wanted to see. I simply looked at the three of them standing on a lawn they were about to be evicted from, celebrating a financial victory that did not exist. A caterer carrying a silver tray of beverages had frozen in shock just a few feet away. I turned to him, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I reached out and picked up a tall glass of sparkling water garnished with a slice of lime. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. The sound was distinct and crisp in the heavy, suffocating silence of the backyard. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the cool liquid wash over my throat. I lowered the glass, my expression a mask of absolute chilling serenity. "Are you quite finished, Richard?" I asked, my voice smooth and conversational, entirely devoid of the anger he was projecting. Richard bristled, his face darkening another shade of red at my total lack of submission. "I told you to get off my property," he barked. I took one step forward, the gravel crunching under my stiletto. I locked my eyes onto his, stripping away the title of father, stripping away the decades of intimidation. I looked at him simply as a tenant who had overstayed his welcome. "You cannot sign over a deed to a house you no longer own, Richard," I said. I did not shout. I did not need to. The words sliced through the summer air like a surgical scalpel. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the stunned silence of a crowd witnessing a family argument. It was the breathless, terrifying silence of a room watching a bomb drop. Richard's mouth stalled halfway open. The vein in his neck stopped pulsing. The arrogant smirk on Jamal's face vanished, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. Brittany's fake tears dried up instantly, her eyes widening in pure confusion. Patricia dropped her arms, her rigid posture faltering as the cold reality of my statement hung suspended in the air. "What did you just say?" Richard whispered, his voice suddenly hollow, stripped of all its former booming authority. "I said you cannot transfer the deed," I repeated, enunciating every syllable with ruthless clarity. "You lost control of this property the moment you defaulted on your primary mortgage. You have no legal authority to assign this estate to anyone. You are currently standing on ground that belongs entirely to a corporate holding firm." Richard shook his head, a nervous, dismissive laugh escaping his lips. "You are lying. You are making things up because you are desperate. Jamal fixed the mortgage. Jamal secured the deed with Apex Holdings." Before Richard could process the catastrophic weight of my words, before Brittany could start screaming again, and before Jamal could attempt to run the deep, heavy crunch of tires on gravel, interrupted the standoff. Every head in the yard turned toward the street. A massive, pristine black Lincoln Town Car glided smoothly up the curb, coming to a halt directly behind my G-Wagon. The passenger door of the heavy Lincoln swung open with a smooth, expensive mechanical click that sliced through the suffocating tension of the backyard. Out stepped Marcus. He moved with the predatory, unhurried grace of a corporate shark who had just caught the unmistakable scent of blood in the water. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that perfectly mirrored my own, projecting an unspoken aura of absolute authority that instantly separated him from the casual suburban attire of the barbecue guests. In his hands, he carried a thick, heavily bound legal folio secured with a thick band and bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of the state. He walked up the driveway with measured, deliberate strides. His leather dress shoes struck the pavement with a rhythmic cadence that sounded exactly like the ticking of a countdown clock. He did not look at the manicured lawns. He did not glance at the colorful patio decorations, the smoking grill, or the sea of stunned faces staring back at him. He was a man on a mission executing a precise tactical strike, and his focus was entirely locked on me. Patricia, her mind already reeling from my outright defiance of Richard, recognized the immediate threat this newcomer posed. She could not comprehend the mechanics of what was happening, but her fierce instinct to protect her territory kicked into overdrive. She stormed forward, abandoning her position by Richard's side, her face flushed a blotchy, uneven red. "Excuse me!" Patricia shrieked, waving her hands wildly as if she were trying to physically swat away a dark cloud. "Who do you think you are? You cannot just pull that monstrosity into our driveway. This is a private family gathering. I demand to know who you are and what you are doing here right this instant." Marcus did not even blink. He did not alter his pace, nor did he offer my mother a single glance. He treated her with the chilling absolute indifference one might reserve for a gust of wind. He smoothly sidestepped her frantic waving, leaving Patricia sputtering in indignant rage behind him, her mouth hanging open as she was completely and utterly ignored on her own front lawn. The crowd of relatives parted instinctively as Marcus approached, their eyes wide, watching the scene unfold with terrified fascination. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, closing the distance between my world and the fantasy they had been desperately clinging to. Marcus planted his feet, stood up perfectly straight, and offered a deep, respectful bow. It was not a casual nod. It was a formal, undeniable acknowledgement of absolute submission to his employer. Boss Marcus said, his voice crisp, professional, and carrying enough volume to be heard clearly by every single person standing within 20 feet. The final transfer deeds and the eviction execution orders fully stamped by the state. He extended his arms, presenting the thick, legally bound folder to me, like a sword being offered to a conquering general. I reached out and took the folder. It was incredibly heavy. It contained hundreds of pages of undeniable financial ruin, forensic accounting, and court-mandated reality. I held it in my hands, feeling the smooth texture of the expensive stock paper, the physical manifestation of the guillotine finally dropping. The silence that descended upon the backyard was absolute. It was a suffocating heavy void, completely devoid of the laughter, the clinking glasses, and the arrogant boasting that had filled the space just minutes prior. My aunts and uncles stood frozen like statues. My father's former business associates, the men who had just been applauding Jamal's fictional boardroom conquests, stared at Marcus with unblinking shock. Richard stood completely immobilized, the purple rage draining from his face to be replaced by a sickly ashen gray. Jamal looked like he had forgotten how to breathe, his counterfeit Rolex hanging limply at his side. The reality of the situation was too massive, too terrifying for them to immediately process. The human brain actively rejects information that threatens to destroy its entire foundation. Brittany was the first to break. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the truth fractured her fragile, carefully constructed reality, and her mind retreated into aggressive denial. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "Oh my God!" Brittany gasped, her voice shrill and trembling as she pointed a manicured finger directly at Marcus. "You actually did it! You really did it!" She turned to the crowd, waving her hands frantically, a desperate, wild look in her eyes as she tried to force her delusion onto the audience. "Look at what she is doing!" Brittany cried out, her voice echoing across the silent patio. "She hired an actor. She went out and hired a literal actor to come here, dress up in a suit, and hand her a pile of fake papers. This is a joke. This is a pathetic, desperate joke. She is so insanely jealous of Jamal and me that she is staging a play in our backyard." She let out another hysterical, high-pitched laugh, clutching her stomach, as if it were the funniest thing she had ever seen. But no one else was laughing. The relatives simply stared at her, then looked back at the cold, unyielding reality of Marcus, his expensive suit, and the undeniable aura of corporate threat he radiated. I did not argue with Brittany. I did not waste my breath trying to convince her of a truth she was terrified to face. I let her manic laughter ring out, isolating her in her own delusion. I turned away from my sister and walked slowly toward the center of the gathering. The guests scrambled backward, practically climbing over each other to clear a path for me. I approached the large glass-topped patio table where Jamal had proudly set down his massive platter of expensive imported steaks purchased with credit cards I was about to seize. I lifted the heavy legal folio high in the air. I let it drop. The thick stack of documents hit the glass surface with a resounding, thunderous crack that made everyone flinch. The heavy cover flap bounced open, revealing the crisp, high-stock corporate paper beneath. Printed across the very top of the page in bold, unmistakable jet-black ink was the official logo of Apex Holdings, LLC. The air in the backyard was so thick with shock that it felt physical, a palpable weight pressing down on every guest. Marcus stepped back, returning to his post by the idling Lincoln, his face a portrait of professional indifference. I left the heavy Apex Holdings folio resting on the patio table, its thick cream-colored pages fanned open to reveal the stark, undeniable legal language beneath the official corporate seal. "Allow me to reintroduce myself," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy, stagnant air with a sharp, resonant clarity. I did not look at the neighbors. I did not look at the stunned relatives. I held my father's gaze, watching the absolute agonizing realization dawning in his eyes as he finally recognized the Apex logo. "I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Holdings. You were so busy tracking the movements of your failures that you never bothered to check the registry of the investment firm that acquired your debt portfolio." I took a sip of my sparkling water, relishing the cold burn against my throat, and continued. My pathetic internet store, as you so eloquently put it, generated $22 million in revenue last year. That capital is exactly what allowed me to acquire the distressed debt on this property 48 hours ago. I reached out my fingers, tracing the embossed gold lettering of the legal documents. I tapped the official deed with my manicured nail, the sharp clack echoing off the nearby patio doors like a gunshot. The bank did not fix anything for you, Jamal, I said, turning my head slightly to address him without giving him the satisfaction of a full look. The bank sold your misery to me. I am your bank. I am your creditor, and legally speaking, I own this house, every single square foot of it. The silence was absolute, save for the faint rhythmic buzzing of a distant lawnmower and the rapid, shallow breathing of the three people standing directly across from me. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Richard, the man who had spent his entire life valuing corporate hierarchy and asset control, looked as if he had been physically struck by a blunt object. His shoulders slumped, the facade of the powerful patriarch dissolving as the ground he stood on was revealed to be mine. "You're lying," Brittany whispered, the words tumbling out as a broken, frantic plea. She snatched a piece of paper from the table, her hands shaking so violently that the document rattled. You just printed this out. You went to an office supply store and made a fake letterhead. This is a game. It has to be a game." "Check the county clerk's digital registry, Brittany," I replied, my voice dangerously soft. "The recording of the transfer was processed yesterday morning. You are not the lords of the manor. You are unauthorized occupants currently residing on private property without a valid lease agreement." I watched as Jamal's smug confidence finally permanently evaporated. He looked like he was searching for an exit, his eyes darting toward the street, toward the neighbors, toward any possible escape from the crushing weight of the truth. His carefully constructed mask of a Wall Street titan had not just slipped, it had been shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Patricia, however, was not one to accept the end of a narrative she had spent years cultivating. She let out a sharp, guttural sound of pure, visceral denial. Her face, usually a picture of composed suburban elegance, morphed into a mask of frantic, sweating hysteria. She surged forward, pushing past Richard with a desperate, ungraceful lunge, her hands clawing toward the table. "It is a forgery!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the silent yard. "This is all a sick, twisted forgery. A daughter cannot legally do this to her own mother." "You are a monster, Quinn. You are a vindictive, hateful creature who has come back here just to destroy your sister's happiness." She grabbed for the documents, her fingers tearing at the thick official pages with a frantic, animalistic intensity. Her nails scratched against the high-stock paper as she tried to crumple the eviction execution orders into a ball, as if destroying the physical paper would magically erase the legal reality it represented. "It is not real," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made several of the neighbors wince. "It is not legal. You cannot just walk onto your own parents' property and tell us we are being evicted. I am your mother. I gave you life." I watched her descent into madness with a clinical, detached sense of satisfaction. She was finally experiencing the exact level of powerlessness she had inflicted upon me for years. Every time she had belittled my career, every time she had laughed at my struggles, every time she had prioritized her reputation over my well-being, she had been banking on the idea that I would never be able to hold her accountable. The bill had finally come due. I reached out and gently but firmly caught her wrists, stopping her frantic destruction of my legal records. I looked down at her, seeing for the first time how small, how fragile, and how incredibly ordinary she actually was. The fear that had always kept me from standing up to her felt as thin and transparent as her own delusions. "The law does not care about your feelings, Patricia," I said, my voice steady, cold, and final. "It does not care about your social status in this neighborhood, and it certainly does not care that you think you are my mother. It cares about contracts, it cares about creditor rights, and it cares about the fact that you have been living in a home you could not afford for months." I let go of her wrists, leaving her standing there gasping for air, the torn documents trailing from her shaking hands onto the grass. The sheer spectacle of her collapse was enough to make the remaining guests slowly begin to back away, realizing they were witnessing the public execution of a family's status. "You have 24 hours to vacate," I said, turning my gaze to Richard, who was still staring at the Apex logo as if it were a brand of fire. "The professional movers will be here on Tuesday morning. I suggest you decide exactly what is yours and what is the property of the estate before they begin the inventory." I picked up the fanned-out documents, smoothed them over with a quick, efficient swipe of my hand, and placed them back into the folder. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not of cruelty, but of profound, long-awaited justice. The trap I had been laying for the last 3 years had finally shut, and there was no mechanism in the world that could force it back open. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the G-Wagon, my heels marking the path of my departure, leaving the now former residents of the estate to deal with the ashes of their own creation. The silence behind me was broken only by the sharp, hysterical sound of Patricia sobbing, the realization finally beginning to sink in that the house, the lifestyle, and the social standing they had sacrificed everything for were gone forever. The so-called Golden family had finally been stripped of their gilding. Patricia lunged across the glass table with a ferocity I had never seen her display. Her manicured hands desperately clawed at the heavy stock paper, her rings scraping against the Apex Holdings logo, as if she could erase the ink by sheer force of will. She shrieked that it was a sick forgery, that a daughter could not legally do this to her own mother, that the universe simply would not allow such a monstrous act. She tore at the edges of the top document, panting heavily, completely abandoning the refined country club persona she had guarded for decades. The fallout was instant and explosive. A cacophony of gasps, panicked murmurs, and scraping lawn chairs erupted across the backyard as the remaining guests scrambled to distance themselves from the imploding family dynamic. Aunt Martha gripped her pearls, her eyes darting frantically between Richard's ashen face and my cold, unyielding stance. The wealthy neighbors Patricia had spent years desperately trying to impress were now treating her like a contagious disease, whispering fiercely to their spouses and edging toward the side gate. Seeing her mother lose her grip on reality finally snapped the last thread of Brittany's composure. The pristine, superior mask she had worn her entire life shattered completely. She let out a guttural, hysterical sob that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. Her knees buckled slightly, her designer heels sinking into the soft grass, and she turned her wild, tear-streaked face toward her husband. "Do something!" Brittany screamed at Jamal, her voice cracking under the strain of absolute panic. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his expensive blazer. "You told me you handled this. You told my father you fixed the mortgage. Do something right now." Jamal was physically trembling. The smug Wall Street hotshot persona had completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, sweating man who realized he had just been backed into an inescapable corner. He looked at his hysterical wife, then at the furious, expectant face of my father, and finally at the dozens of judging eyes burning holes into him from across the patio. His massive ego, built entirely on lies and unearned confidence, demanded a response. He snatched a pair of silver BBQ tongs off the grill, gripping them like a weapon as he puffed out his chest and took a step toward me. He was sweating profusely, dark patches blooming under the arms of his tailored shirt, his breathing ragged and shallow. "You think you are smart?" Jamal barked, pointing the greasy tongs directly at my face, desperately trying to project authority. "You think you can just march in here with some fancy folder and kick us out onto the street? You are completely out of your depth, Quinn. Have you ever heard of squatters' rights? Or the legally required 30-day eviction notice? You cannot legally make us leave today. We have rights. We are established residents of this property, and no court in this state will let you bypass the mandated residential protection protocols." He looked around the yard, nodding frantically, trying to rally the remaining guests to his makeshift legal defense. He was throwing out buzzwords, hoping something would stick, hoping to buy himself even a few hours to figure out an escape plan. Richard seemed to latch onto this lifeline, his posture straightening a fraction of an inch as he glared at me, waiting for me to falter under Jamal's supposed legal expertise. I did not falter. I let a slow, terrifyingly calm and predatory smile spread across my face. I tilted my head looking at him with the detached amusement of a cat cornering a very slow mouse. I knew you would say that, Jamal. I said, my voice smooth and carrying effortlessly over the panicked whispers of the crowd. You know all about the eviction process, do you not? You are quite the expert since you literally just went through the exact same procedure in Manhattan last month. Jamal flinched as if I had struck him across the face with a baseball bat. The color entirely drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly, translucent white. He dropped his arm, the BBQ tongs clattering noisily onto the stone patio, the sound echoing like a death knell in the sudden silence of the yard. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice a hoarse, confused croak. He looked from me to Jamal, his desperate hope rapidly souring into a new, deeper terror. Jamal owns a penthouse in Manhattan, he told us. Jamal owns absolutely nothing, I corrected, stepping closer to the table, forcing Richard to look at the undeniable proof. He was renting a studio apartment in Queens under a false name, and he was formally evicted for failing to pay rent for 6 consecutive months. He knows the 30-day notice rule because that is exactly how much time the marshals gave him before they threw his imitation designer suits onto the sidewalk. He has 0 assets, 0 capital, and 0 legal standing to claim squatters' rights on an estate he has never formally inhabited or paid a single utility bill for. Brittany let out a piercing shriek, dropping Jamal's arm as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. She stumbled backward, her hands flying to her mouth, staring at the man she had married with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The grand illusion of her elite, wealthy marriage was burning to the ground right in front of her country club friends. You lied to me, Brittany gasped, her chest heaving. You told me you were a senior partner. You told me you had millions in offshore accounts. I can explain, Jamal stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his eyes darting wildly. It is just a temporary liquidity freeze. I have equity coming in. Quinn is manipulating the data. There is no data to manipulate, I stated coldly, cutting off his pathetic excuses. And you do not have 30 days, Jamal. None of you do. I reached into the heavy Apex Holdings folder. The crowd held its collective breath, watching my every movement with morbid fascination. Patricia had finally stopped clawing at the papers, her hands resting limply on the glass table, her eyes wide and terrified as she realized I was not finished. The disownment they had planned for me had completely backfired, and I was about to deliver the absolute final stroke. You see, standard residential eviction laws apply to legitimate tenants. I explained, my voice echoing with total unshakable authority. They apply to people who hold valid leases or have established documented residency, but that is not what is happening here today. I pulled one final pristine piece of paper from the very back of the folder. I held it up, letting the afternoon sun catch the raised notary seal at the bottom corner. I turned it slowly, ensuring that Richard, Brittany, and Jamal could clearly see the text. Then I lowered the document and placed it squarely in front of my mother. This, I announced, tapping the bottom of the page, is why you do not have 30 days. This is why the marshals are authorized to remove you from these premises immediately upon request. I leaned in close, forcing Patricia to look down at the document. It was a voluntary surrender of property rights, waiving all standard eviction grace periods in exchange for a short-term, high-interest bridge loan. And sitting right there at the very bottom of the page was Patricia's messy, unmistakable signature. I reached down to the glass patio table, my fingers bypassing the torn edges of the documents Patricia had frantically tried to destroy, and lifted the final pristine sheet of paper. I held the signed document up high, gripping it firmly by the edges so the afternoon sunlight could illuminate the sloppy, hurried cursive scrawled across the bottom line. The blue ink stood out in sharp, undeniable contrast against the heavy corporate watermark. I let the heavy silence stretch, ensuring every neighbor, every aunt, and every former country club friend gathered on the lawn had a clear, unobstructed view of the definitive proof. 30 days ago, I announced, my voice carrying a lethal calm that sliced through the stifling summer heat. The exact day you threw my clothes out into the hall in garbage bags, The day you laughed and told me I would never amount to anything more than a financial burden. I took a slow, measured step toward my mother. Patricia was paralyzed, her eyes glued to the signature on the page. The manic screaming energy that had fueled her tantrum just moments ago had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow sinking dread. On that specific afternoon, my legal team sent a certified 30-day notice to quit to this address via registered mail. I continued articulating every syllable with deliberate precision. It was sent in a distinct heavy envelope. It required a direct signature from a resident of the household to prove legal receipt of the eviction proceedings. Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her gaze darted from the paper to my face, a desperate, frantic search for an escape route that simply did not exist. I watched the gears turning in her mind as she desperately tried to rewind her memory, trying to recall a day that had been nothing more than a blur of self-indulgence and cruelty to her. I turned my gaze squarely to my mother, locking onto her terrified eyes. Patricia, you were so busy signing for your maxed-out credit card deliveries that you signed for this certified letter without even opening it. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly gray. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand blindly reaching out to grip the back of a lawn chair to keep her legs from giving out. There were 5 boxes from Neiman Marcus that day. I reminded her smoothly, painting the picture for the entirely captivated audience surrounding us. 3 from Saks Fifth Avenue. You were practically vibrating with excitement over a new collection of designer shoes you purchased using credit lines secured by a house you no longer owned. The courier handed you a digital clipboard. You did not check the sender. You did not look at the parcel. You simply scribbled your name, desperate to tear into your new boxes, completely unaware that you were signing away your right to contest this foreclosure. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Aunt Martha brought a trembling hand to her chest, her eyes wide with scandalized horror. The wealthy neighbors who had tolerated my parents for years began exchanging knowing, disgusted glances. The illusion of the elite, untouchable family had not just been shattered. It had been exposed as a grotesque, hollow fraud brought down by sheer vanity. "I did not," Patricia stammered, shaking her head so rapidly her pristine blowout fell into disarray. "I thought it was a receipt. I thought it was just a receipt for the shoes. You tricked me. You sent it wrapped in something else." "I sent it exactly as the state mandates," I corrected coldly, not granting her a single inch of mercy. With a bright red certified mail sticker and a return address explicitly stating the name of the legal firm representing Apex Holdings. You legally acknowledged receipt of the eviction notice 1 month ago. You waived your right to a hearing the moment you put pen to paper. Richard violently shoved his way past Brittany, his face a terrifying mask of raw, unfiltered rage. But this time his fury was not directed at me. He rounded on his wife, his massive frame towering over her shrinking figure. "You signed it!" Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice making Patricia flinch violently and cower behind the chair. "You signed a legal document from a corporate entity without reading it, because you were too busy buying shoes we cannot afford." "Richard, please, I did not know," Patricia shrieked, bursting into genuine terrified tears. "She tricked me. She knew I was expecting packages. She timed it on purpose to ruin us." "You stupid, vain woman!" Richard bellowed, his hands clenching into tight fists at his sides. The unified, impenetrable front they had weaponized against me for decades was dissolving into absolute toxic chaos right before my eyes. "You literally signed away our rights. You handed her the keys to our estate because you could not be bothered to read a damn envelope." "Do not yell at her," Brittany cried out, stepping forward to defend her mother, though she looked utterly terrified of her father's wrath. "Quinn is the one doing this. Quinn is the monster here." Jamal, however, remained completely silent. The self-proclaimed financial genius was slowly backing away from the epicenter of the argument, his eyes darting toward the street, where Marcus stood stoically by the Lincoln. Jamal realized that the money was gone, the house was gone, and the wealthy family he thought he had conned his way into was entirely bankrupt. The survival instinct of a career grifter was kicking in, and he was already calculating his physical exit strategy. I ignored their imploding dynamic. I did not care about Richard's fury, Patricia's tears or Brittany's whining. I had not orchestrated this moment to watch them tear each other apart. I had orchestrated this moment to claim what was mine. I raised my left arm, pulling back the crisp, tailored cuff of my blazer to expose my wrist. The afternoon sun caught the polished gold and diamonds of my Cartier timepiece, glinting brightly against the manicured backdrop of the yard. I lifted my right hand and extended my index finger. The fighting instantly ceased. Richard, Patricia, Brittany, and even Jamal froze, their eyes drawn to my deliberate movement. The entire yard fell into a dead, breathless silence, waiting for the final strike. I tapped the crystal face of my luxury watch twice. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a judge's gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. That 30-day window expired exactly 2 hours ago, I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute chilling finality. You are officially trespassing on my property. Patricia stared at her own handwriting like it was a venomous snake. She snatched her hands back, tucking them against her chest. Richard stepped forward, his eyes scanning the bridge loan agreement. The absolute finality of the ink on the page stripped away the last remnants of his bluster. The booming, tyrannical patriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate man who finally understood that his financial life was over. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw working frantically. He looked from the document to me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of the desperate, eager-to-please daughter he had bullied for 30 years. Finding nothing but cold granite, he drastically shifted his tactics. The screaming ceased. He straightened his posture, adopting the grave, authoritative tone of a disappointed father trying to rein in a rebellious child. "All right, Quinn," Richard said, lowering his voice to a forced, gravelly calm. He held up his hands in a gesture of false surrender. "You made your point. You had your fun. You staged a very elaborate prank to get back at us for some perceived slight. I admit it was effective. Now drop this nonsense. We are going to go inside the house, sit down in the living room, and discuss this as a family." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The absolute audacity of the man was almost impressive. "We are not a family, Richard," I replied, my voice ringing out across the patio. "We are a landlord and a group of unauthorized occupants. There will be no discussions in the living room. You do not have a living room." The veins at his temples flared to life again. His attempt at patriarchal diplomacy had failed, and his fragile ego simply could not tolerate being dismissed in front of the neighborhood elite. He took 2 heavy, aggressive steps toward me, his face twisting into a snarl of pure rage. He reached out with a thick, heavy hand, aiming directly for my upper arm, fully intending to drag me bodily into the house to hide his shame behind closed doors. His fingers never made contact. Marcus moved with blinding, fluid speed. 1 second the lawyer was standing passively by the patio table, and the next he had smoothly inserted himself directly into the space between Richard and me. Marcus did not throw a punch. He did not shove. He simply raised his forearm, executing a perfect, immovable block that stopped Richard's lunging momentum instantly. Richard collided with Marcus's arm and staggered backward, clutching his own wrist in shock. "I strongly advise against completing that action, sir," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, projecting the terrifying calm of a man who destroyed lives for a living. "If you make physical contact with my client, I will have you arrested for assault before you can draw your next breath. Add that to the impending fraud charges regarding the forged deed you attempted to pass off earlier, and you will be spending your retirement in a federal penitentiary." Richard froze, his chest heaving as he stared at the impenetrable wall that was my legal counsel. The physical threat had been neutralized just as effortlessly as the financial one. Off to the side, the spectacular collapse of Brittany and Jamal was reaching its crescendo. Brittany was gripping the sleeves of Jamal's expensive tailored blazer, shaking him with a frantic, unhinged energy. Her perfect hair was a mess, her makeup smeared down her cheeks in dark, wet tracks. "Fix it," Brittany screamed, her voice breaking into a guttural screech. "You told my father you had connections. You told me you owned the mortgage. Do something right now. Call your lawyers. Call the executives." Jamal was not calling any executives. The smooth-talking crypto investor had completely malfunctioned. He was ignoring his hysterical wife entirely. his eyes glued to the screen of his smartphone. His thumbs were flying across the digital keyboard with panicked, frantic speed. He was sweating so heavily that the collar of his shirt was soaked through. He was not looking for a legal loophole. He was looking for an escape route. He was checking flight schedules, calling in favors from shady associates, doing whatever it took to flee the state before the authorities started asking questions about his counterfeit collateral. He did not even look up as Brittany continued to scream at him. He simply sidestepped her, moving closer to the edge of the driveway, plotting his physical retreat from the disaster he had helped orchestrate. The true horror for my parents, however, was not unfolding on the patio. It was unfolding on the perimeter of the lawn. The wealthy neighbors, the country club board members, the local politicians that Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives groveling to impress were no longer just watching. They were actively documenting the destruction. Dozens of smartphones were held high in the air. The tiny glowing red recording lights stared back at my parents like a firing squad. Every humiliating scream, every exposed lie, every pathetic attempt to assert authority was being captured in high definition. The story of the elite, untouchable family being publicly evicted by the daughter they had thrown away was already being immortalized. It would be shared in group chats, played at dinner parties, and whispered about in locker clubs by sunset. The social execution was absolute, permanent, and entirely inescapable. Patricia looked at the sea of recording phones, her mouth opening in a silent scream of pure social agony. She brought her hands to her face, trying to hide from the digital lenses, completely paralyzed by the reality that her reputation was dead and buried. Then, cutting through Brittany's sobbing and the low, excited murmurs of the recording neighbors, came a new sound. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing from the main avenue. Within seconds, the pitch sharpened, multiplying and bouncing off the manicured facades of the suburban mansions. The distinct, urgent blare of police sirens was rolling down the street, tearing through the quiet afternoon air, growing louder, faster, and exponentially closer. The wail of the sirens peaked a deafening crescendo that vibrated in my chest before abruptly choking off with a sharp chirp. Red and blue lights violently strobed across the immaculate white siding of the estate, casting long, frantic shadows over the frozen guests. Two heavy local sheriff's cruisers swung wide around the corner of the cul-de-sac. They did not park politely along the curb. The heavy tires bumped over the pristine concrete lip and rolled directly onto the manicured front lawn, crushing Patricia's imported Japanese hydrangeas beneath thick, muddy treads. This was not a melodramatic television standoff. There were no tense negotiations or drawn-out emotional monologues. This was the stark, clinical reality of a standard, highly efficient American property eviction. The heavy doors of the cruisers pushed open in unison, and 4 uniformed deputies stepped out into the humid afternoon air. Their presence was a sudden physical manifestation of consequence, a rigid wall of authority that the Golden family had never once had to face. The lead sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and a completely unbothered, hardened demeanor, adjusted his heavy utility belt. He held a thick metal clipboard in his left hand, a heavy stack of papers clamped firmly beneath the metal clip. It was the court-ordered execution of eviction, stamped sealed, and entirely undeniable. Richard, running purely on the fumes of his shattered ego, attempted one final desperate play for control. He squared his shoulders, pasted on his most patronizing, authoritative expression, and marched toward the approaching officers. "Deputies, thank God you are here," Richard boomed, waving a hand toward Marcus and me. "There has been a massive, chaotic misunderstanding. I am Richard Sterling. I know the police chief personally. This woman is my daughter, and she is having some sort of mental breakdown, trespassing on my property and fabricating legal documents." The sheriff did not slow his pace. He did not extend a hand. He did not even offer Richard a polite nod. "Step aside, sir," the sheriff commanded, his voice a flat, booming baritone that sliced through Richard's country club bravado like a machete. He did not wait for Richard to comply. He simply kept walking, forcing the former patriarch to stumble backward to avoid a physical collision. The sheriff bypassed the gaping neighbors, the overturned patio chairs, and the fanned-out legal documents, walking with heavy, deliberate strides straight toward Marcus and me. "Quinn Sterling," the sheriff asked, locking eyes with me. I stepped forward, reaching into my blazer pocket. I handed him my state-issued identification, along with the original watermarked court order that Marcus had prepared. The sheriff scrutinized the photograph, checked the embossed seal on the paperwork, and compared the address against his own clipboard. He nodded sharply, a gesture of absolute bureaucratic confirmation, and handed my ID back. "Everything is in order, Ms. Sterling," the sheriff stated, his voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. "The property is legally yours." He turned his broad back to me and faced the patio. His eyes swept over Richard's flushed, humiliated face, Patricia's tear-streaked, ruined makeup, Brittany's violently trembling frame, and Jamal's frantic, cornered stance. The sheriff did not see former titans of the community or wealthy suburbanites. He saw unauthorized, recalcitrant trespassers who were currently holding up his afternoon schedule. "Listen up and listen carefully." The sheriff projected his voice, hard and uncompromising, addressing the four of them as a group. "I hold the finalized writ of possession for this address. The legal grace period has expired, and the current owner has formally requested your immediate removal." He unclipped a heavy black radio from his utility belt, glancing down at the digital clock glowing on its screen. "You have exactly 15 minutes to gather essential personal items and vacate the premises." The sheriff announced, the words dropping like anvils onto the patio. "Essential means daily medications, your wallets, and a single change of clothes. You do not attempt to take furniture. You do not attempt to pack up electronics, art, or valuables. Everything currently inside those walls is now the legal property of the estate holder until a court inventory can be conducted." Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. "My clothes! My jewelry! You cannot tell me I cannot take my own diamonds. I have thousands of dollars in my closet." "Ma'am, if you try to stuff your pockets with jewelry, my deputies will empty them on the front lawn before they put you in the back of my cruiser." The sheriff shot back, entirely immune to her theatrics. "You have exactly 15 minutes. If you are still on this property in 16 minutes, you will be arrested, handcuffed, and charged with criminal trespassing. The clock starts now." Jamal, seeing his window of opportunity closing, tried to slowly edge his way toward the side gate, his eyes fixed on the street. A younger deputy immediately stepped into his path, a hand resting casually on his belt. "The exit is through the front door, buddy," the deputy warned softly. "Do not make me chase you." The sheer brutal reality of the badges, the flashing lights painting their pristine home, and the booming, apathetic voice of law enforcement shattered the very last fragile pane of the family's collective delusion. There was no more arguing. There was no more gaslighting, no more twisting the narrative, no more demanding that the universe bend to their whims. The rigid, unforgiving hand of the law was standing on their patio with handcuffs unspooled and ready. Total, unadulterated panic set in. Richard's chest began to heave, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps as he looked from the sheriff to the towering facade of the house he had spent decades bragging about. The illusion of his power was gone, stripped away by a man with a clipboard and a badge who did not care about his stock portfolio. Patricia dropped to her knees right there on the patio stones, burying her face in her hands, her wails echoing against the brickwork as she realized she was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back. Brittany grabbed Jamal by the collar, screaming in a shrill, unrecognizable voice, demanding he fix it, demanding he call his imaginary lawyers, while Jamal simply stared blankly at the deputy blocking his escape, his jaw slack with terror. The remaining guests, the neighbors they had bled themselves dry to impress, were practically sprinting for their cars, abandoning their half-eaten plates and expensive wine glasses, desperate to escape the blast radius of the family's total destruction. The countdown had begun, and their perfect gilded world was dissolving by the second. The 15-minute countdown hung over the manicured backyard like a guillotine. The deputies fanned out their hands, resting loosely on their utility belts, forming an impenetrable human barricade that officially transformed my childhood home into an active crime scene. The rhythmic flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers out front painted the patio in harsh, unforgiving strokes, illuminating the sheer naked terror on my family's faces. They were entirely paralyzed by a reality they could not bribe, bully, or manipulate their way out of. Brittany was the first to break the frozen tableau. Her perfectly curled hair was clinging to her damp cheeks, and her chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. She turned to Jamal, her eyes wide and wild, still desperately clinging to the fairy tale she had sold to everyone in our social circle. She lunged forward, her hands clamping onto the lapels of his tailored silk blend blazer. "Do something!" Brittany shrieked, the sound tearing through the humid air and causing the nearest deputy to tense. "Jamal, you have to fix this. Call your lawyers. Call your rich investor friends in Dubai. Tell them to wire the funds right now. Book us the penthouse suite at the Four Seasons. Just get us out of this nightmare." She was shaking him, but Jamal felt like a dead weight. The suave, arrogant tech investor who had spent the last 2 hours sipping premium whiskey and belittling my existence was entirely gone. In his place stood a cornered, sweating grifter who had just realized his grand con had collided head-on with federal fraud statutes and armed law enforcement. Jamal stared at the sheriff, his eyes tracking the cold, hard steel of the handcuffs resting on the officer's belt. The illusion of his wealth could not protect him from a criminal trespassing charge. Jamal snapped. The intense pressure of the impending arrest crushed the final fragments of his carefully constructed persona. He violently seized Brittany's wrists, his grip tight enough to make her gasp in pain, and wrenched her hands off his expensive jacket. He pushed her back with a sudden, aggressive force that made her stumble over the edge of a patio paver. "Are you completely delusional?" Jamal roared, his voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek that completely shattered his smooth, baritone facade. He threw his arms out wide, gesturing frantically at the armed deputies surrounding them. "Look around you, Brittany. Do you see any investors coming to save us? Do you see a helicopter waiting on the roof to whisk us away?" Brittany stared at him, her mouth opening and closing in mute shock. Richard and Patricia, still frozen in their own personal hells, slowly turned to watch the pristine golden couple implode. "I do not have any money!" Jamal screamed, the admission tearing out of his throat in a spectacular display of absolute ruin. "I do not have investor friends in Dubai. I do not have a massive offshore portfolio. I am completely, utterly broke." "No," Brittany whispered, shaking her head in frantic, desperate denial. "No, you showed me the accounts. You bought me the diamond tennis bracelet. You wear a $40,000 watch." Jamal let out a harsh, barking laugh that bordered on actual insanity. He reached across his body, his fingers clawing aggressively at his left wrist. He unclasped the heavy, gleaming gold Rolex that he made sure was visible in every single photograph they took. With a roar of pure frustration, he hurled the timepiece directly onto the hard stone patio. The watch hit the ground with a sickening metallic crack. The gold casing popped open immediately, scattering cheap plastic gears, a counterfeit battery, and fake glass diamonds across the expensive stonework. It was a visual representation of his entire existence, cheap, fragile, and entirely fraudulent. "It is fake!" Jamal bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the debris. "Everything is fake. The jewelry is cubic zirconia. The cars are leased under a shell company that is currently being investigated for bankruptcy fraud. I maxed out 6 different credit cards just to afford the deposit on the Manhattan apartment I was just evicted from." He stepped closer to Brittany, his face red and contorted with a vicious, blaming rage. He was not taking responsibility. He was throwing her directly under the bus to save his own fragile ego. "Your family bled me dry." He spat his words, hitting her like physical blows. "I spent every single cent of credit I could secure trying to keep up this stupid, pathetic, rich aesthetic you demand. The country club dinners, the designer clothes, the ridiculous loans I took out just to impress your father, it completely ruined me. I have nothing left to give you, and I am not going to jail for your family's foreclosure." Jamal did not wait for her to process the catastrophic betrayal. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the back door. The sheriff simply stepped aside, raising his wrist to check his watch, silently confirming that Jamal was using his allotted 15 minutes to flee. Jamal vanished into the house, leaving a suffocating, devastated silence in his wake. I watched the exact moment Brittany's world collapsed. The golden pedestal she had perched upon her entire life was yanked out from beneath her feet. She stood trembling on the patio, staring at the shattered plastic gears of the fake Rolex glittering in the sunlight. The realization that she had married a con artist, that her entire identity as a wealthy elite socialite was built on a mountain of maxed-out credit cards and lies, physically crushed her. Less than 3 minutes later, the front door burst open. Jamal did not return to the patio. I watched through the large glass windows of the living room as he sprinted down the front hallway. He was clutching a single scuffed canvas duffel bag, stuffed haphazardly with whatever clothes he could grab. He did not look for Brittany. He did not ask if she was coming. He was abandoning the sinking ship to save his own skin. Brittany saw his reflection in the glass and snapped out of her shock. She let out a desperate wailing cry and bolted around the side of the house, her heels tearing divots into the manicured lawn. She intercepted him right at the edge of the driveway, just as he was yanking open the door to his leased sports car. "Jamal, you cannot leave me!" she sobbed, throwing herself at him, her hands desperately grabbing at the straps of his duffel bag. "Where are we going to go? The police are right here." Jamal did not hesitate. The survival instinct of a cornered rat took over entirely. He planted his hand squarely in the center of Brittany's chest and shoved her backward with absolute, unfeeling, brutal force. Brittany flew backward, her high heels giving way beneath her. She crashed hard onto the damp grass of the front lawn, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Jamal threw his bag into the passenger seat, slammed the car door shut, and gunned the engine. He reversed out of the driveway so fast the tires smoked wildly, swerving around the parked sheriff's cruisers before speeding down the suburban street, leaving his wife crying in the dirt. The golden couple was instantly, permanently destroyed by the crushing pressure of poverty. Brittany lay sprawled on the grass, gasping for air, her designer dress stained with mud. She looked up at the flashing police lights, the armed deputies, and the towering facade of the house she no longer owned. She finally understood that her husband was a broke, cowardly fraud, and she had just been completely abandoned to the police. The acrid smell of burned rubber hung heavy over the manicured lawn, slowly dissipating into the humid afternoon air. The silence that followed Jamal's frantic, screeching exit was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the low, rhythmic crackle of the police cruiser's radios and Brittany's ragged, wheezing gasps as she lay paralyzed in the dirt. She did not attempt to stand. She did not attempt to wipe the mud from her pale cheeks or straighten the torn fabric of her imported silk dress. The reality of her sudden, brutal abandonment had short-circuited her brain, leaving her staring blankly at the sky like a broken doll tossed aside by a careless child. The deputies did not offer her a hand. The wealthy neighbors, still standing safely on the perimeter with their smartphones raised, did not rush forward to comfort the fallen golden child. The spectacle had transitioned from a scandalous neighborhood dispute into a pathetic, irredeemable tragedy, and no one wanted to risk catching the contagion of their ruin. Richard stood frozen on the patio, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The veins in his neck, usually bulging with manufactured outrage, had flattened. His face was a sickly mottled gray. He watched his favored daughter lying in the dirt, abandoned by the man he had practically worshipped for his imaginary offshore accounts. He looked at the armed officers waiting patiently by the front door. Then he looked at me. The transition was instantaneous and repulsive. The booming tyrannical patriarch vanished forever. The man who had spent 3 decades dictating the terms of my existence, who had belittled my career, mocked my appearance, and gleefully signed away my inheritance, simply deflated. His shoulders slumped forward, collapsing inward under the crushing weight of his absolute financial and social bankruptcy. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me, his expensive leather loafers dragging across the patio stones like dead weights. "Quinn!" Richard rasped, his voice sounding thin, fragile, and utterly broken. He held out his hands, palms up, in a gesture of pathetic submission. He was no longer trying to intimidate me. He was trying to negotiate for his survival. "Please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. You have won. Look at your sister. Look at your mother. We have nothing. We have nowhere to go." I did not blink. I stood beside Marcus, my posture straight, my expression carved from granite. I let the silence stretch, letting him drown in the awkward, humiliating reality of his own begging. Just give me 1 week, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking as he took another desperate step forward, his eyes darting frantically toward the deputies. 1 week in the house. Let me make some calls. Let me liquidate some minor assets. I can make this right, Quinn. I promise you I will make this right. We can draw up a contract right now. Just call off the sheriff. Give us 7 days to pack with dignity. Dignity. The word tasted foul, even just floating in the air between us. He wanted dignity after trying to pass off a forged deed. He wanted dignity after publicly humiliating me for 30 years. He wanted dignity while his favorite daughter was currently shivering in the mud. There are no minor assets left to liquidate, Richard, I stated, my voice echoing off the brick walls of the estate. You are functionally bankrupt. You have exactly 7 minutes left before those deputies escort you off the premises in handcuffs. You are wasting your time negotiating for a week you are never going to get. The blunt, clinical refusal shattered whatever remained of his hope. Richard let out a dry, rattling sob and buried his face in his trembling hands, completely broken. That was the exact moment Patricia realized her husband's pathetic diplomacy had failed. Her entire life had been built on riding the coattails of his authority, wielding his money and his status as a weapon to control everyone around her. With his power gone, she was left entirely defenseless. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the sprawling suburban mansion, it was all evaporating right in front of her eyes. She was about to be homeless, exposed to the blistering judgment of the very social circle she had ruthlessly dominated. Patricia's survival instinct kicked into overdrive. She bypassed logic, bypassed pride, and bypassed any remaining shred of human dignity. She threw herself forward, stumbling over the patio furniture, her designer heels skidding wildly on the stone. She did not just approach me, she collapsed entirely. Patricia hit the patio stones hard, her knees taking the full force of the impact. She scrambled forward on all fours, a desperate, sobbing mess of ruined makeup and tangled hair. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands and clamped her fingers directly onto the fabric of my tailored trousers. "Quinn, please!" Patricia wailed, her voice a shrill, hysterical screech that caused several of the recording neighbors to physically flinch. "You cannot do this. You cannot throw us out into the street like animals. I am your mother." She gripped my pant legs tighter, burying her tear-streaked face against my knees, weeping with a violent performative intensity. It was the ultimate desperate manipulation card, the final weapon in a toxic parent's arsenal, when all other avenues of control have been completely severed. She was betting everything on the ingrained biological guilt of a daughter she had spent decades actively destroying. "I gave birth to you," Patricia sobbed, her body shaking uncontrollably as she clung to me. "I raised you, I fed you, I am your blood, Quinn. You cannot do this to your own blood. Please, I am begging you, I am begging my little girl, do not leave me out here. Do not take my home away." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. For 30 years, this woman had systematically eroded my self-worth. She had laughed while Brittany tore me down. She had eagerly helped Richard orchestrate the theft of my grandfather's trust fund. She had planned to celebrate my eviction over expensive champagne just hours ago. I searched my heart, digging through the layers of trauma, the years of desperately seeking her approval, the endless nights spent wondering why I was never enough for her. I searched for a flicker of sympathy, a single drop of biological loyalty, a momentary pang of guilt. I found absolutely nothing. There was no warmth left. The emotional well was bone dry. Looking at Patricia groveling on the patio stones, clutching my clothes, and utilizing the very concept of motherhood as a cheap bargaining chip to save her designer wardrobe, I felt entirely liberated. The umbilical cord of guilt was finally permanently severed. She was not my mother. She was just a bankrupt, cruel woman who had finally run out of victims. I did not step back. I did not try to pry her frantic, clawing fingers off my clothes. I stood perfectly still, letting her sob, letting her feel the cold, immovable reality of my indifference. Slowly, deliberately, I bent at the waist. I lowered myself until my face was only inches from hers. Patricia stopped wailing. She felt the shift in my posture and looked up, her mascara smeared in thick black streaks down her cheeks. Her eyes, red and swollen with panic, locked onto mine. She was searching for a lifeline, searching for the obedient, desperate to please daughter she had bullied for a lifetime. I held her gaze, my expression completely void of mercy, preparing to deliver the final, inescapable truth that would end her delusion forever. 30 days ago, Patricia, I began, my voice ice cold, carrying across the silent yard and cutting cleanly through her manufactured hysterical sobbing. 30 days ago, you marched into my bedroom. You dragged my suitcases out of the closet, and you threw my belongings onto the hardwood floor of the hallway. Patricia opened her mouth, her lips trembling desperately, trying to formulate an excuse, a lie, a rationalization for her past cruelty. I did not give her the chance to breathe. You stood right over me, sneering with absolute contempt. You chose a fake broke crypto scammer over your own daughter. You looked at the man who just shoved your favorite child into the mud and sped away in a leased car to avoid arrest, and you decided he was the future of this family. You decided I was disposable. Patricia whimpered, her manicured nails digging frantically into the fabric of my trousers. Quinn, please, I did not know we were tricked. We were trying to protect the family legacy. You have no legacy, I replied, the absolute truth of the statement hitting her like a physical strike. And when I reminded you that I paid the mortgage, that I paid to live here, that my hard-earned money was the only thing keeping the lights on in this massive monument to your vanity, you did not care. You looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust and you screamed, "Go live in the streets!" Patricia recoiled violently. The words she had wielded as a weapon a month prior had returned as an inescapable life sentence. Her grip on my legs loosened, her hands falling weakly to the patio stones. She stared up at me, the final traces of her manipulative facade melting away, leaving behind a terrified, aging woman who had just realized she was entirely out of options. The realization that she could not guilt her way out of poverty completely paralyzed her. I straightened my posture, taking a deliberate step backward, completely out of her reach. I broke eye contact with the weeping woman on the ground and looked directly at the lead sheriff standing patiently by the sliding glass doors. I gave him a single sharp nod, signaling that the conversation was permanently concluded. I looked down at Patricia one last time. I am not doing anything to you, I stated, my tone devoid of anger, offering only the sterile clinical finality of absolute justice. I am just honoring your own philosophy. Go live in the streets. The sheriff stepped forward immediately. His heavy boots thudded against the patio stones, signaling the end of the 15-minute grace period. Time is up, the sheriff boomed, his baritone voice echoing off the brick facade of the estate. Deputies, clear the property. The officers moved with practiced mechanical efficiency. 2 deputies flanked Patricia, gripping her by the upper arms and hauling her to her feet. She went completely limp, her legs refusing to support her weight, letting out a guttural, sustained wail of pure agony. She thrashed weakly against their grip, but the officers easily overpowered her, marching her forcefully toward the front of the house. Richard did not fight. The complete destruction of his ego had left him hollowed out. A younger deputy approached him, handing him a heavy black plastic trash bag, unspooled from a roll on the cruiser. You have exactly 60 seconds to step inside, grab your daily medications, and exit through the front door. The deputy commanded, his hand resting securely on his utility belt. If you touch anything else, you will be leaving in handcuffs. Richard took the trash bag with trembling hands. His face was a sickly ashen gray. He stumbled through the sliding glass doors, disappearing into the house to gather the meager remnants of his shattered existence. Off to the side, Brittany was finally pulling herself up from the mud. Her expensive tailored silk dress was ruined, smeared with dark brown dirt and grass stains. Her perfect hair was a tangled, chaotic mess around her face. She was shivering uncontrollably, her eyes wide and vacant, completely traumatized by Jamal's brutal betrayal and violent escape. A female deputy approached her, handing her a matching black plastic trash bag. Brittany took it mechanically, her fingers numb, looking at the cheap plastic as if she did not understand what it was. The 60 seconds evaporated. The deputies escorted Richard back out the front door. He was clutching the black trash bag to his chest. Inside it, I could see the square outlines of prescription pill bottles and a single pair of walking shoes. That was it. That was the entirety of the great Richard Sterling's current net worth. Patricia was dragged out next, sobbing hysterically into her own plastic bag, her cries echoing down the manicured suburban street. The neighbors, the country club board members, the local politicians, and the gossiping elite, still standing on their pristine lawns with their smartphones held high, documented every humiliating second of the eviction. The red lights of their recording cameras stared back at my parents, capturing their absolute social execution for the entire world to see. The deputies marched the three of them down the wide, sweeping concrete driveway. They did not stop at the curb. The officers directed them firmly past the property line, physically escorting them onto the public sidewalk. "Do not return to this address," the lead sheriff warned, standing squarely on the boundary line, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "If you cross this property line again, you will be arrested for trespassing. Keep walking." I turned my back on the patio and walked slowly through the massive sliding glass doors. I moved through the expansive living room, my heels clicking sharply against the imported hardwood floors. The house was completely silent now, the oppressive toxic energy of my parents permanently excised from the walls. I walked past the grand staircase, past the formal dining room where they had mocked my career, and opened the heavy solid oak front doors. I stepped out onto the sprawling elevated front porch of the estate. My estate. I rested my hands on the pristine white railing, taking a deep breath of the humid afternoon air. The chaotic flashing lights of the police cruisers reflected off the massive arched windows behind me, casting long shadows over the driveway. I looked down the street. Patricia, Richard, and Brittany were trudging slowly down the concrete sidewalk. They had no cars. They had no money. They had no allies. They were walking aimlessly into the sprawling, affluent suburban neighborhood, carrying their worldly possessions in black plastic garbage bags, permanently erased from the empire they once ruled. 6 months evaporated since the afternoon I watched those black plastic garbage bags disappear around the corner of the cul-de-sac. In that time, the sprawling suburban estate underwent a radical necessary exorcism. The moment the court officially cleared the house of my parents' remaining hoarded possessions, I brought in a commercial demolition crew. Every suffocating, pretentious detail Patricia had painstakingly curated was stripped down to the studs. The heavy velvet drapes that blocked the sunlight, the outdated floral wallpaper, the hideous crystal chandeliers, and the oppressive mahogany furniture that smelled of cigar smoke and perpetual judgment. It was all tossed directly into an industrial dumpster. In its place, I built a sanctuary of productivity, light, and modern innovation. Walls were knocked down to create a massive open-concept floor plan that breathed easily. Sleek glass partitions replaced the heavy dark wood doors. The space was transformed into a vibrant, high-tech secondary office and weekend retreat for my top-performing e-commerce team. The walls were painted crisp, clean white, adorned with vibrant modern art that actually meant something to me. High-speed servers hummed quietly in what used to be Richard's forbidden study, and the formal living room now held standing desks, ergonomic lounge chairs, and a fully stocked espresso bar. The house, once a tomb of toxic expectations, finally possessed a real heartbeat. Tonight, the expansive new dining area was filled with warmth, genuine laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. I was hosting a celebratory dinner, but the people seated around the massive reclaimed wood table were not bound to me by biological obligation or forced loyalty. This was my chosen family. Marcus sat at the head of the table, swapping animated stories with my lead marketing director. My top developers, the childhood friends who had offered their couches when I had nothing, and the brilliant wealth manager who helped me quietly secure my empire, were all passing around platters of catered gourmet seafood and roasted vegetables. There was no underlying tension. There were no barbed insults disguised as harmless jokes, no impossible standards to meet, and absolutely no screaming. It was pure, unadulterated peace. I did not have to shrink myself to fit at this table. I was sitting exactly where I belonged. As I listened to the bright, easy conversation flowing around me, my mind briefly wandered to the people who used to occupy this space. The justice the universe had served them was thorough, permanent, and entirely of their own making. Richard and Patricia's spectacular fall from grace had been swift and merciless. With their credit scores obliterated, their assets seized, and their social circle aggressively shunning them like a contagious disease, they had been forced out of the affluent suburbs entirely. They were currently renting a cramped, perpetually damp one-bedroom apartment in a notoriously rough neighborhood on the far east side of the city. The grim reality of their new socioeconomic status had rapidly aged them both. Richard, the man who used to terrorize corporate boardrooms and belittle service workers, was now working 30 hours a week as a greeter at a big box hardware store. He spent his days standing on a concrete floor until his back ached, wearing a bright orange vest, forced to smile and nod at customers who routinely ignored him. Patricia, entirely stripped of her country club memberships, her weekly spa days, and her designer wardrobe, had taken a minimum wage job scanning items at a discount grocery store checkout lane. She lived in constant agonizing fear of being recognized, often pulling her uniform visor down low over her eyes whenever a vaguely familiar face walked through the sliding glass doors. They spent every exhausting, humiliating shift working just to afford basic groceries and keep the lights on in their tiny windowless apartment. Brittany's fate was arguably the most poetic of all. Jamal had not just fled the state, he had completely vanished into the ether. Within 24 hours of abandoning her in the mud on the front lawn, he had blocked her number on every single platform, deleted his social media accounts, and severed all ties. He did not just leave her with a broken heart. He left her holding the bag for the catastrophic financial ruin he had orchestrated. Brittany had blindly co-signed on his fraudulent luxury vehicle leases, his high-interest credit cards, and the massive personal loans he used to fund his counterfeit aesthetic. Now the former golden child was drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of inescapable debt. Her meager wages were heavily garnished by aggressive creditors. She was working grueling double shifts as a waitress at a loud, greasy chain restaurant located right off the interstate. Her delicate hands were cracked and blistered from carrying hot plates and scrubbing sticky tables. The ultimate irony was that she was now forced to serve the exact kind of entitled, rude customers she used to be. She spent her nights sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor of a rented room, entirely isolated, having alienated every friend she ever had through years of mimicking our parents' insufferable arrogance. I stepped away from the lively dining table, the sound of my friends' laughter echoing pleasantly behind me. I pushed open the sleek new sliding glass doors and walked out onto the back patio. The air was cool and crisp. The exact spot where Patricia had fallen to her knees and begged for her vanity was now occupied by a beautiful modern fire pit surrounded by comfortable lounge seating. I held a glass of expensive, perfectly chilled white wine in my hand. I walked to the edge of the patio, looking out over the impeccably landscaped lawn. I turned, slightly raising my glass, looking directly into the lens of the reality I had meticulously documented and survived. They always say blood is thicker than water. I stated, my voice calm, confident, and ringing with absolute satisfaction. But they forget the full quote, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." Sometimes the people you share DNA with are the very anchors trying to drown you. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to cut the rope and let them sink. I brought the crystal glass to my lips, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the wine, savoring the taste of absolute freedom. Have you ever had to use the cold hard law to teach a toxic family member a lesson they'll never forget? Tell me your story in the comments below.